Much, Mr. Chairman. Last week in Bali, Indonesia, the speaker at the UN Climate Change Conference had some pointed comments about what must happen in order to achieve a meaningful agreement on global warming. The speaker had first-hand knowledge of the political landscape in the United States. The speaker said that international negotiators had to move away from failures that have hampered global warming talks since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change had its first meeting in Berlin 12 years ago in 1995. The speaker, referring to the so-called Berlin Mandate, said that the meeting put in place an inadequate process that exempted China, India, and other developing nations from taking significant steps to reduce emissions. By exempting these nations, the speaker said, it made the subsequent Kyoto Treaty impossible to ratify in the United States Senate. The speaker warned that negotiators in Bali must not make the same mistake of exempting China and India and other developing nations. The speaker said that many in the United States were ready to move forward with substantial greenhouse gas reductions, but not, and I quote, without the knowledge that other folks are cutting in a way that's meaningful, unquote. The speaker wisely said that technology transfer and assistance with developing countries is crucial. To quote the speaker again, quote, the industrial world can't do it alone, unquote. And while that speaker at Bali and I disagree on many global warming policy proposals, I am pleased that my chairman's own junior senator, John Kerry of Massachusetts, grasped the importance of including China and India in the process. Senator Kerry's statements are a breath of cool, fresh air when compared to those of another American who spoke in Bali. While Senator Kerry laid out conditions that must be met in order for a global warming treaty to be approved by the United States Senate, another former presidential candidate simply laid blame for lack of promise at the feet of America. And while Vice President Al Gore was calling America the obstructionist at the Bali conference, he failed to notice that other nations were joining the United States in opposing the mandatory reduction targets in the Bali roadmap. Mr. Gore also failed to acknowledge that China and India initially refused to commit to taking actions on their own to reduce emissions before eventually accepting that they need to be part of the solution too. And I'm very pleased that China and India agreed to language in the Bali roadmap for, quote, nationally appropriate mitigation actions that must be measurable, reportable, and verifiable. While there are some provisions in the Bali roadmap that raise concerns, I think overall it's a good agreement. Negotiators have given policymakers all over the world the time to promote the development of technology that will make emission restrictions achievable without damaging the economy and hurting jobs, and thus making those restrictions and changes politically untenable in any democratic country in the world. If China and India were willing to work with the international community, it's possible to develop a meaningful climate change treaty that creates real environmental benefits, protects jobs in the economy, and advances technology. Without China and India, any global warming treaty would simply be an invitation for manufacturers to move their operations to these unregulated economies. And where would our economy and environment be? I opposed the Kyoto Treaty from the start because I knew what we were getting into with that flawed agreement. And I am disappointed that there are those in this country that did not heed what Senator Kerry said then and what he said 10 years ago when the Bert Hagel resolution came up. And because those cautions were not heeded, the Senate didn't ratify the treaty, and eventually we lost at least a decade and probably more in reaching an agreement that could be worldwide in application, was technology-based, and which would be politically acceptable both in this democracy as well as in other democracies around the world. I hope that this roadmap from Bali can start us on the path toward a more realistic and effective global emissions reduction solutions. But I must caution everybody that if we fall into the trap of what caused Kyoto to fail, then we will be losing even more time in this fight. I thank the gentleman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I'm kind of more of a veteran of the climate change wars than any of my colleagues that are sitting here on the dais. And I hearken back to what Senator Kerry said at Bali, and that is that any treaty that does not involve the third world is doomed to failure in the United States Senate. I think that is a given. That is a political fact of life, and I salute Senator Kerry as a leading Democrat in making that observation to delegates who might not have wanted to have heard that message. Now, that being said, I guess I'd like to ask the panelists to briefly say, are we, as a result of Bali and the softening of the administration's position, the signing up of the developing countries, and particularly China and India, do you think we're going to hear less demagoguery from the European Union on this subject? Because what the EU has been saying, and particularly what the German Environment Minister, Herr Gabriel, has been saying, certainly is not going to bring about the type of consensus needed to wrap this up in 2 years. Who'd like to be first? Helm.
My sense is that we really saw a coming together of the EU with the developing world and most of the other nations in agreement on how to move forward. And I think, said my testimony, the EU's putting these targets out set a bar that was very useful. And I think
okay, now let me interrupt you on that.
Okay.
The deal that was made in Berlin, which exempted the developing world and gave the EU a much lower emissions reduction target, the so-called EU bubble, as a result of two factors that occurred since 1990 that had nothing to do with this issue, basically was a deal where the developing world didn't have to do anything, and the EU was able to, what we refer to in this business as pose for holy pictures, and playing a game of economic gotcha against the U.S. and Japan and Russia and perhaps some smaller countries like Australia and Norway as well. Now, if we're going to continue playing the game of economic gotcha, you're not going to see very much support in the United States Senate for what proceeds henceforth. And, I think that what I am interested in seeing is whether the EU will admit not only that Kyoto was a failure, but the mistake that made Kyoto a failure was the agreement that came from Berlin in 1995.
I think there's two responses. One, we're beyond that, as everyone on the panel said. I mean, we basically have that clear statement that verifiable national actions will be a part of this, and we have the track record I presented in terms of what China, India, Brazil, Mexico have already done. I think in terms of the EU, they did make significant reductions, and they're now prepared to participate in that larger effort that will go forward in terms of with the developing countries. So I think we're going to see a significant package coming forward. So we're beyond sort of the history of did we do the right thing on Kyoto or not. We've now stepped up to the point where everybody's going to take real steps.
Unfortunately, Mr. Markey and I couldn't go to Bali because we were busy doing the job we were elected to do here. But reading the quotes in the press, particularly from Minister Gabriel, did not give me much heart that the EU had gotten the message, and particularly the largest economy within the EU, which is that of Germany.
Could I reply to your question, Mr. Sensenbrenner? I think we really can't expect much more from the European Union than demagoguery, because that's really all they've got. They are not willing to take the actions that they committed to reduce their emissions, and as you notice, have already noted, their emissions went down between 1990 and 1997 for reasons that had nothing to do with emissions reductions. And so I think what we can hope for in future negotiations is that the U.S., together with Japan, Canada, and several other leading nations, will be able to lead these negotiations out of the Kyoto dead end. And as long as the EU is unwilling to match its actions to its rhetoric, I think they will become more and more marginalized in this
The facts simply don't bear out what Mr. Ebel's saying. I can say data here. I'll have to submit to the record. It shows each country.
What's left, Mr. Helm, is my time. And I will just say that the two factors that allowed the EU to reduce their emissions from 1990 to 1997 were the fact that Mrs. Thatcher decided to put the British Coal Miners Union out of business and change electric generating in the UK from coal to natural gas, and the merger of East Germany and West Germany, and the closing of the Stalin-era East German industries, which belched hot air and greenhouse gases and were environmental disasters and workplace safety disasters. That had nothing to do with compliance with the Rio Treaty. My time's up. I yield back.